Ambassador Daalder, greetings and great to see you on First Western. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Really happy to be here today.
I would like to start with the results of NATO summit in Vilnius. You tweeted that NATO's decision regarding Ukraine's membership in Vilnius is a big victory for Ukraine. Why do you think so?
Well, I think just remember where Ukraine was before this meeting and where it is today. Before the meeting, there was no consensus within the NATO alliance on the question of whether Ukraine should be a member of NATO. At the meeting, it became very clear that there now is a consensus, that the question isn't really one of when, not of whether, but of when and how. The problem that now confronts Ukraine in terms of an invitation and in terms of actually becoming a member is how do you bring a country into the alliance when that country is in the middle of a war? There is now a commitment by NATO to start thinking about how to do that. So this is the issue of process, of moving towards something that NATO has agreed will happen. As NATO said, Ukraine's future and Ukraine's place is in NATO. That is an important step. The question now becomes, how do we get from that step to actual membership?
Unfortunately, lots of Ukrainians have been embarrassed and frustrated by latest NATO decision. What could give us a hope that Ukraine will become a NATO member in the nearest future?
The hope is on two fronts. First, and importantly, to see how the war itself is progressing. NATO needs to get to a point where bringing Ukraine into the alliance is something it can do without at the same time joining the conflict directly, which NATO leaders from day one have said they are not prepared to do. They will do what they can to help Ukraine defend itself. But until there is more clarity about where the conflict is heading, actually bringing Ukraine into NATO is very difficult. But secondly, and I think importantly, there are concerns within the alliance, shared, I think, among all members, that Ukraine needs to still address some very important issues relating to corruption, and that the government can and will, there's very much a hope and an expectation that some of those issues will be addressed. So I think that by the time NATO leaders once again meet for their 75th anniversary summit in Washington next year, that the clarity of when that will happen will become much clearer. And let me repeat something that President Biden said as he left Vilnius to go on his trip to Finland and then home. He said, not only did he say it was a matter of when, not if, Ukraine joining, but he also talked about a timeline in which clarity would emerge in the next few months. So I think the movement forward is real. It's significant. I understand the frustration of people in Ukraine. It would have been much better had Ukraine been a member of NATO before the full-scale invasion by Russia, which probably would not have happened had they been a member. But we are where we are today, and now the question is how to move forward.
But why do you think that Washington summit could really make a difference?
Well, I think one of the reasons is because before the Vilnius summit, there was a very serious debate, both within and among NATO governments, about whether the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO was a good one. I think that was settled at Vilnius. I think the United States made very clear, and President Biden made very clear, that bringing Ukraine into NATO now is the policy not only of NATO, but also of the United States. And that's a big step. So now the question doesn't shift to whether, but it shifts to when and how. Secondly, we have elections in the United States in 2024, and so do a number of other countries. And I think the time to make sure that some big decisions are made before those elections is arriving. So I am optimistic that prior to the Washington summit, we will have greater clarity about when Ukraine will be able to join NATO.
Also, recently you said that Ukraine could become a member of NATO even with occupied territories by Russia. How could it look like? How could it be possible?
So NATO membership, of course, as a country, if Ukraine were to join, all of Ukraine, including all of its territory, would be regarded as Ukrainian and its sovereign right. But other countries have joined NATO, and other countries have enjoyed security guarantees akin to those of NATO without controlling all of their territory. Remember, in 1955, West Germany became a member of NATO, even though formally no one had accepted that Germany's division was de jure. The issue of unification very much was on the cards, and nevertheless, there was a decision to bring in West Germany. In a similar, and I think perhaps even more appropriate analogy, the United States has extended an Article 5 guarantee to Japan, even though there are parts of Japanese territory that remain occupied today by Russia. And the way in which that commitment to defend Japan has been expressed is to say that the commitment only extends to the territories that are administered by the Japanese government. So I can foresee a day when, under the right circumstances, Ukraine as a whole will become a member of NATO, but the commitment to implement Article 5 would apply only to the territories that it controls and not to the territory that it doesn't control. Now, it doesn't mean that NATO would accept Russian control over Ukrainian territory. It means that the issue of security guarantees would not extend to that territory, because if it did, of course, NATO would be a direct participant in the war, which is the one thing that has prevented NATO from moving forward today.
But don't you think that it could only throw the war and provide Putin with some time to prepare to the next invasion of Ukraine?
So it is likely that a move of this kind is possible only when the conflict is much more localized than it is today, and in which the level of fighting presumably is significantly less than it is today. And in that case, that's one of the reasons why no one in NATO, including those who are most supportive of Ukrainian membership in NATO, support bringing in Ukraine today. That's a problem that we have faced. So the question is, how do you make sure that that issue can be addressed before the entire war is solved? Because the war may not be solved for many, many years. Now, as to the question of whether Putin would try to prepare for a resumption of the war and a further invasion, I'm sure he would. However, at that point, the Ukrainian territory held and administered by Ukraine will be NATO territory. And NATO has been very clear that NATO will defend every inch of its territory. And so a decision by Vladimir Putin to resume the war, to try to invade that part of Ukraine that it does not control, means a decision not just to fight Ukraine, but to fight all of NATO.
But don't you think that so Putin could do everything he wants on the occupied territories?
Well, unfortunately, he can do everything he wants on the occupied territories today. And until those territories are liberated completely, he will be able to do so. If there were a real prospect of Ukraine by itself, without NATO membership, being able to liberate all of those territories, that, of course, would be preferable. And indeed, the United States and NATO countries and others are providing Ukraine with those means. The problem is, what happens if that is not possible, at least in the short term? If there is no way to liberate those territories, are we then to say that Ukraine should not become a member of NATO until the war has ended on terms favorable to Ukraine? That may take many years. So there is a choice here. And it's a choice not only for NATO, but frankly, a choice for Ukraine. Ukraine can be a member of NATO, even if part of its territory is occupied, I believe, but it cannot be a member of NATO if it continues to insist that it needs to liberate all territory militarily and at the same time be a member. That's the choice. And my view would be that it is wise for NATO, it is wise for Washington to suggest that NATO membership is something that can be moved forward on today for those parts of the territory that it administers, and that the question of when the occupied territories will be liberated is one that is left for later, politically and perhaps in time diplomatically. Remember, territory that is in the ends of wars, territories don't always come back to where they used to be, but that doesn't mean that as an international recognition that Russian occupied territory is now Russian. For 50 years, the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states. No one recognized that they were part of the Soviet Union, and in 1991. They became independent states and were recognized as such. And I think the prospect of the ultimate return of all of Ukrainian territory to Ukraine is stronger if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO than if Ukraine stands on its own.
But would you be in favor to providing Ukraine with more security assistance to help us to defeat Russia on the ground and to achieve a full military victory?
Yes, I would be in favor of continuing to provide Ukraine with all the means it needs to defend itself and to reconquer the territory that is currently controlled by Russia. But there is a fundamental question of whether a Ukraine that is a fourth the size of Russia can have the manpower and the materiel to achieve that goal militarily. There are some significant doubts whether that is indeed the case. And as a result, as we are seeing in the current counteroffensive, fighting offensive military activity against a well-positioned, dug-in defensive force is hard. Doesn't mean Ukraine shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that the U.S. and others should not continue to provide Ukraine with all of the assistance that it needs. And I have long been an advocate of providing Ukraine with longer-range missiles. I am an advocate of providing Ukraine with air power. But I also am realistic about whether that is, in fact, going to fundamentally change the balance of power in such a way as to allow Ukraine to recapture all of the territory. And so the choice, it may not be between military victory or political defeat. The choice may have to be in one point for political victory and attempting to achieve what needs to be achieved longer term, over time, as a member of NATO rather than by itself. It's a choice for the Ukrainian people to make. However Ukraine decides, I am confident that the United States and other countries will help Ukraine to the maximum extent possible. But in war, as in politics, we have to look at different options and different ways of trying to achieve what is our fundamental goal. And the fundamental goal is clear. This is a war, first, not about territory, but about Ukraine's ability to decide its own destiny. Vladimir Putin wants to prevent Ukraine to be a Western country. The Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government want Ukraine to be part of the West. Part of the West means being a member of the European Union and being a member of NATO. If the liberation of Ukrainian territory is the condition for both, it may take a very long time till we get there.
Let's cover also peace talks in Saudi Arabia. How could you assess the results of these peace talks?
Well, there's nothing practically agreed that moves things forward other than a number of working groups. But it is important for all of the major powers in the world, except Russia, to come together in a place that is hosted by a major power, the Saudis, to have a discussion about how to pursue the 10-point peace plan that President Zelensky proposed at the G20 summit last year in Bali. And that is a significant political victory for Kyiv, a deserved political victory for Kyiv. Yes, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, among other major countries, are not yet fully embracing the 10-point peace plan, but they are not rejecting it. And that means that there is a prospect for those countries to put more pressure on the one country that was not there, Russia, in order to start thinking seriously about how we might be able to end the war on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. And those terms are clear. An end to the war will have to lead to the full withdrawal of all Russian forces from all of Ukrainian territory back to the borders that Ukraine has enjoyed since 1991. And I think the peace talks were significant in making sure that countries that have been on the fence and in some sense have been supportive of Russia, like China, were there and are now committed to continue to those talks. It's always better to continue to have these kinds of conversations than not. And in that sense, I think this is a vindication for the diplomacy that President Zelensky and his team have engaged in over the past 18 months.
So China participated in these talks despite the fact that Russia was not invited. Don't you think that it could be a sign that China is changing its policy towards the war in Ukraine?
Well, it would be great if China were to join the international community in condemning Russia's invasion and seeing this as the illegal and brutal act it is. I don't think that joining one conversation is likely to change Xi Jinping's mind immediately. However, and this is important, and I think very important, the fact that they showed up means that they are at least willing to listen. The fact that China wants to be seen as part of a solution to this conflict rather than part of the war-fighting and war-causing party is a positive step. Hopefully, over time, as these discussions continue, China will see it in their interest to pressure Russia to find a way to resolve this conflict on terms that are favorable to Ukraine. And it is important that the terms are favorable to Ukraine, not only accepting the territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence of Ukraine, but also the full withdrawal of all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. That ultimately is what this conversation needs to be about. And the fact that China is a participant is a hopeful sign.
Also, CNN reports that President Putin wants to hand out until the next presidential elections. He hopes that President Biden will lose upcoming elections, and he hopes that President Trump will help him. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that President Putin and others, many of America's adversaries, are rooting for the return of Donald Trump to power, and I can see the argument inside the Kremlin that hope that Trump will solve a problem that Vladimir Putin has created by engaging in this full-scale, brutal invasion of Ukraine may be high. The reality, however, is that the fighting is continuing. Russia is suffering strategically and militarily and economically and politically. It was just demonstrated that it stands alone in the world because the rest of the world came together in Saudi Arabia. Its economic crisis will continue to deepen in the months ahead. And in the end, Donald Trump may not even run for the presidency, let alone win the presidency, given the legal problems he is in. So I think this demonstrates a desperation on the part of Vladimir Putin, a hope that somehow his problem that he created will be resolved by a new American leader. That leader may be Joe Biden. And if Joe Biden is president, the kinds of policies he has pursued over the past 18 months will continue, a strengthened response from the West, full-scale support for Ukraine, and the prospect of NATO membership for Ukraine. So if I were Mr. Putin, I would start thinking about how can I minimize the damage to my country, the damage militarily, the damage economically, the damage politically. And one way to do that is to stop this brutal war and withdraw his forces from Ukraine, rather than hoping that somehow the American elections and Donald Trump will save him.
Former National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, says that if Trump is elected as a president, then the US could pull out of the NATO. What is the probability of such scenario?
Well, I think the point here is important, that if we care about NATO, if we care about strong support for Ukraine, if we care about having an international system in which the United States works closely with its allies, then it probably is a reality that Donald Trump is not going to be particularly helpful in that regard. Because he has demonstrated in his previous term of office that he is not a big supporter of the kinds of policies that the United States has long pursued, including for 75 years as a leading member of NATO. And I think in part the election will be one way to test where the United States is on that and so many other issues.
If Trump is elected as a president, would Europe support Ukraine even without the US?
Well, I think Europe's interest in supporting Ukraine is, of course, exists separate from whether the United States will support Ukraine. But it's also important to recognize that Europe continues today not to have the kinds of deep defense capabilities that the United States has because of decades of underinvestment in defense. And that if the United States were no longer to support Ukraine militarily, the support for Ukraine will go down, even if the Europeans continue to provide support for Ukraine. And I would hope that under the circumstances that you mentioned, Europe will find new ways to provide as much support to Ukraine as possible. Clearly, Ukraine is not going to the Europeans are not going to move in the same direction that the United States would under those circumstances. But under those circumstances, the situation for Ukraine would be drastically changed.
Thank you, Ambassador Daalder, for your time and for participation in our interview, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I wish you and the people in Ukraine all the best and all the success. The reconquest and full independence of Ukraine is not only in Ukraine's interest, it's in the interest of the United States, of all NATO countries, and indeed of the world writ large. And let us hope it happens sooner rather than later.